So now that we've talked about the basics, sort of the bird's eye view of transformative learning, what we really need to do is go back in time to all of the adult learning theory that led up to transformative learning. There's really no way that you can understand this theory unless you look at the influences of people on Mezirow like John Dewey, Paulo Freire, Jürgen Habermas, and all the work that has come after Mezirow, like that of Stephen Brookfield and Victoria Marzik and Watkins. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually backtrack a little bit and get into this thing called learning itself. So we start with the influence of John Dewey. So here you are again. Let's just begin with you. And that's you, a picture of you sort of pondering the world, okay? John Dewey says that what we actually do when we talk about a real form of learning is really a sort of a reflective practice. Just sort of what he might call a careful, intentional, and considerate reflection on reality at all times so that we don't really take things for granted. And he called this a genuine education. That's the heart of the theory that we're talking about here, is a genuine education. This is different than what we might call, or Paulo Freire would call, the banking methodology of education, which is really more informative. This is sort of like dumping information into your head like you do when you're a child. You learn about mathematics and social studies and so forth. But learning in adulthood is a more genuine form of learning, is learning through experience. And Dewey used something called continuity principle to describe this, and that is that when we go through life, as we talked about in previous videos, we've got experience, but there's the continuous transformation of experience. He calls this continuity principle. So it's not like we step outside of experience, we think about our experience and go back into it. Although that does happen sometimes with some adult learning methodologies such as after-action reviews or just simply taking time to reflect on what happened. But more often, we don't really have so much time to do that in the day. So we're sort of in this continuous flow, this continuous loop of having the experience, reflecting on it, acting on it, and then revising our assumptions ever so slightly, and so on and so forth with each additional experience. So Donald Schoen sort of takes this to the next level when he talks about two sort of ways of reflecting in time. So Donald Schoen talks about reflection on action and reflection in action. So in the case of transformative learning theory, we think about being met with a disorienting dilemma. And when that happens, we don't always have the luxury of being able to say, time out, and walking away and thinking about it. So most transformation actually occurs over longer periods of time, which Mezirow talks about as incremental transformative learning. It's not always as romantic as it looks in the movies, which Mezirow would call epical. This is sort of like, boom, transformation. I'm a whole new person. Sometimes it takes a while for the transformation to take grip in your life. So there's two ways that you can reflect, and depending on these relationships between reflection and time, you're reflecting on different things. So when you're reflecting on action, you actually have a language. You put a language around what happened. You talk about it. You create a story. And when you weave that story, you're doing it through the lens of your assumptions. It's nice to have that time to do that, but there's also reflection in action. And this is something that's inordinately important because being able to act on the fly has become more and more important these days, especially when we look at organizational change, emergent leadership, and conflict. The ability to course correct. Now, when you're reflecting in action and you're actually in the moment, there is no real language about it. Instead, you're working with symbols and intuition and deeper things that you might say that language is the wrapper around. So this is sort of like the guts of experience. And reflecting on action is fundamentally different from reflecting in action. So besides Dewey and Schoen, we also have David Kolb. And David Kolb talks about, he sort of blows up this idea of continuity principle, right? And he talks about 4 different ways that we go about transforming our experience into an understanding of the world. And he mentions that people tend to have preferences. So one preference, my shorthand here, is to have concrete experience. So think about if you get a new cell phone and you want to learn about the new cell phone. Just picking it up and dialing the number and sort of doing what you always did and allowing the experience of the cell phone to sort of wash over you, and through that process, simply learning. These are the people who just dive into it. And if you're one of those people, this is most likely your preference. The next preference is remote observation. These might be the type of people, it reminds me of my dad, who would like to look over the shoulder, my shoulder in this case, at how I use the cell phone, and then sort of look at that, pull it into perspective, and then try it out himself. So these are people who take more of a removed process of learning. But it's still, there's still a moment where they integrate it. And then you have something called abstract conceptualization. And this is simply looking at the phone and thinking, what are all the things that I might do with this phone? And planning in your head all of the great ways that you can use the phone, and maybe even thinking about how one operation in the phone connects with another, and you might connect those operations together to operate the phone. And so if you're that type of person, you're probably a preference of abstract conceptualization. And the last one, last but not least, is active experimentation. And according to David Kolb, this is a little bit different than concrete experience, because what it entails is thinking about what you're going to do and then testing it out, actively experimenting in the world. So if you think about any sort of learning that you've gone through, for instance, if you're learning how to play baseball or learning how to give good feedback to an employee, you could think about the way that each of these learning styles impacts the preference. Also, the preference that you have tends to be the way that you teach others, because you privilege that way of learning. And these are really important things to understand. So now we've got John Dewey, Schoen, Kolb, and I couldn't do this discussion without mentioning that when we think about adult learning, or learning in general, we think about the 4 walls of education. You come into a place, you get a little lecture like this, you get a grade. Now, adult learning doesn't really happen that way because we're in the midst of life, right? So Karen Watkins and Victoria Marzik and Watkins, talk about something called informal or incidental learning versus formal learning. And they have a lot of information out there on that, but thinking about informal or incidental learning is thinking about learning that happens during the day, right? So a lot of learning is not explicit, it's more tacit. We just sort of like learn by doing, learn by interacting. There's learning by the water cooler, what's going on. There's learning by observing your mentor. That is less formal in nature. And a lot of times, the less formal it is, the more powerful it becomes, and the more part of you that becomes. Now, there's all of these processes that we're discussing. What Jack Mesereau does is he talks about what all of that reflection is aimed at. So he talks about a lot more, but he also talks about the what. Okay? What in the world are we reflecting on? And he categorizes this in three ways. There's content, process, and premise. If we think about content, it's sort of looking at a transcript and saying, what actually occurred here, right? What are they saying? What words did they use? What words did I use? How did we interact with each other? What were the sort of foci that we had when we were having a discussion, so to speak? And process is more of what's going on at the meta level. Am I attached to something here? Is there anxiety that's playing out? Did the person react, or did they respond? So more procedural ways of reflecting, or procedural objects to reflect on. And the third is the premise. This is the level of assumptions that guide our behaviors. So our underlying assumption about the world, one might be, and we go back to our discussion about authority, how much do I get a say in all of this? So if you go to a doctor, for instance, think about how many times you have ever sought a second opinion, right? A second opinion is saying to authority that I'm not quite sure if even though you've got all the education in the world and you've got the diploma on the wall, I'm not quite sure that I believe fully that this is reality. So I'm going to go and seek a different opinion. These are all really strong preferences that we have that come from our relationship with reality and authority and guide our decisions along the way. And we know that having a second opinion is usually pretty helpful. Now, there are also three different ways of looking at objects and reflecting on them. And these are offered by, so these are Mesereau's. And then you have Brookfield. So Stephen Brookfield. And Stephen Brookfield talks about three different things that you can look at that maybe we call them levels of assumptions, right? So you've got descriptive assumptions, prescriptive assumptions, and paradigmatic. Just think paradigm. The descriptive level of assumption that we look at is basically how we describe the story. It's the words that we use, very similar to content reflection. It not only includes the words that we use, but it includes where we've censored ourselves in our story, what we chose to say, how far back in time we begin our story, how we situate ourselves as a protagonist, who the antagonist is, and so on and so forth. Story is one effective way of doing this, but just listening to the way that somebody describes a situation can tell you a lot about their assumptions around the situation. And of course, we begin with ourselves. If I asked you to tell a story about yourself, you might begin at childhood, or you might begin last week. You can also begin with your great-great-grandfather and pulling in the importance of culture. All of this is how you describe the world, and so these lead to really important hints about your assumptions. The second level is prescriptive level of assumptions, and that level of assumptions looks at the way that you feel things should happen. So like a doctor would prescribe a medicine, you prescribe a certain way of behaving and being and interacting in a certain situation based on your past experience. So these are called prescriptive assumptions. One great hint of when prescriptive assumptions are available is when you hear the word should. I should do this, or it's as if I should do this. So there's lots of shoulds, right? In any given situation, there might be a few different ways of doing things. Or if you ask certain philosophers, there's an infinite ways of going about working through a conflict or an opportunity that you're trying to develop innovation around. But looking at the should, right, is very similar to your premise assumptions. Now there's paradigmatic assumptions, and this level of assumptions is your core beliefs. And you hold these beliefs to be so core that you wouldn't even view them as assumptions. They simply are. So it's very difficult for people to get to that level of paradigmatic reflection because it's just like the air they breathe, the water that they drink. It's just inherent to who they are. And yet, these are assumptions that we can reflect on. So what we've done in this video is we've gone back and looked at learning from experience. You might think about, if you take a transformation that you feel you've experienced in life, asking yourself, what did I focus on? Who did I include in the discussion? Was it genuine? Was it formal or informal? How much was I reflecting on action and how much was I reflecting in action? And if you like to think about what to reflect on, one of the questions you can ask yourself is just closing your eyes and thinking back to a time where you felt stuck in life, or perhaps you feel stuck right now. So what is that stuckness? How would you describe it? What story would you shape around it? What do you feel should be happening? Where do those assumptions come from? There's a lot to work with here, and it gets even deeper in my next video.